There is a moment, somewhere between 5 o'clock and the first breath of evening air, when something in your body shifts. The shoulders drop, the jaw unclenches, the noise inside your head grows quieter, not because anything has changed, but because the week has ended. Friday has arrived and something ancient in you already knows it. You didn't decide to feel this way. Nobody told your nervous system to relax. It simply happened. The way seasons change, the way tides pull back from the shore. So here's the question worth sitting with. Why do humans need to escape at all? And why, across thousands of years and dozens of different cultures, have we always found a way to build that escape into the rhythm of our lives? Long before there were offices or factories or alarm clocks, human beings were already dividing time into rhythms: work and rest, effort and release. The idea of a break is not a modern invention. It is something much older than that. In ancient Mesopotamia, one of the earliest known civilizations, there is evidence that certain days were set aside as inauspicious, days when rulers and priests were advised not to work, not to make decisions, not to act. These were not holidays in the way we think of them today. They were pauses built into the calendar because people believed that time itself moved in cycles, and that some moments were simply not meant for human effort. The Babylonians, for instance, observed a 7-day structure tied to the lunar cycle. As the moon moved through its phases, they marked specific days for rest and reflection. The number 7 appeared not as an accident, but as an attempt to sync human life with something larger: the movement of the sky, the turning of the natural world. The Jewish tradition carried this idea forward in one of the most deliberate ways in recorded history. The Sabbath, Shabbat, was not merely a suggestion, it was a commandment. 1 full day, every 7, was to be protected from labor, not because rest was a reward for hard work, but because rest was considered sacred in itself. To stop working was to honor something greater than productivity. It was an act of trust, a belief that the world would continue turning even if you put down your tools. This is worth pausing on, my friends. For most of human history, the reason for rest was not efficiency. It was not so that people could return to work feeling refreshed. The reason was meaning. Rest existed because life was understood to be more than labor. There was something in the human experience that required silence, stillness, and return. Other cultures found their own versions of this rhythm. Ancient Rome had its festivals, days scattered through the calendar when courts closed, markets quieted, and the ordinary rules of daily life were suspended. These were not random celebrations. They served a function. They broke the relentless forward motion of time and reminded people that existence had more than one register. What is striking, looking across all of these different traditions, is how consistent the pattern is. Cultures that had no contact with each other, living thousands of miles apart, arrived at the same basic conclusion: that human beings cannot move in one direction forever, that something in us requires interruption. Not weakness, interruption. A built-in pause that allows the person to remember they are more than what they produce. The need to escape, then, is not a sign of laziness or dissatisfaction. It is written into the oldest human calendars we have ever found. It existed before any government legislated it, before any employer granted it, before anyone had a name for it. The weekend, as we know it, came much later. But the needed answers is ancient, as old as the first person who looked up from their work and felt, without fully understanding why, that they needed to stop. For most of human history, rest was informal. A farmer could decide to stop when the light faded. A craftsman could slow down between seasons. Time was not yet divided into neat blocks of hours owned by someone else. Work and rest existed in the same continuous flow, shaped by weather, daylight, and the natural rhythm of the body. Then the factories arrived. The Industrial Revolution, which spread across Britain and Europe through the 1800s, changed the relationship between human beings and time in a way that had never happened before. Work moved indoors. It moved onto a clock. Machines did not care about daylight or seasons. They ran continuously, and the people operating them were expected to do the same. 14-hour days were not unusual. 6-day weeks were standard. For many working people, the only guaranteed rest was Sunday morning at church, and even that was shrinking under the pressure of production. Something important was lost in this shift, and people felt it, even if they could not always name it. The old, informal rhythms of rest had been replaced by a system that treated human energy as a raw material, something to be extracted as efficiently as possible. Workers were tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. They were being asked to exist only as instruments of output. and the part of them that needed pause, that needed to breathe, had nowhere to go. The pushback began slowly. Labor movements across Britain, the United States, and Europe started demanding shorter hours and protected rest days. The arguments were not always philosophical. They were practical and sometimes urgent. People were getting sick. Accidents in factories increased when workers were running on almost no rest. Even from a purely economic point of view, it became difficult to ignore that exhausted human beings were not productive human beings. In 1908, a cotton mill in New England became one of the first factories in the United States to introduce a 5-day workweek, specifically to accommodate Jewish workers who observed the Sabbath on Saturday and Christian workers who rested on Sunday. It was a practical solution to a scheduling problem, but it planted an idea. Henry Ford expanded that idea in 1926 when he introduced the 40-hour 5-day workweek across his automobile plants. His reasoning was partly strategic. He believed that workers with free time would buy more goods, including cars. Rest, in Ford's logic, was also a market. But whatever the motivation, the effect was real. Millions of workers suddenly had 2 days that belonged, at least in theory, to themselves. The 2-day weekend did not arrive as a gift. It was negotiated, argued for, and slowly legislated into existence over decades. In the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 helped formalize the 40-hour workweek at a national level. Other countries followed their own paths, but the pattern was similar. Rest moved from being a personal or religious practice to being a legal right. Consider what that means. For the first time in history, an entire society agreed, in writing, that human beings were entitled to time that was not for working. Not because of faith, not because of tradition, but because it was recognized as a basic human need. The escape cycle had been institutionalized. What was once ancient and instinctive had become, at last, official. Something strange happened once the weekend became official. People had fought for it, waited for it, built their entire working week around the promise of it. And then Friday evening arrived, and instead of feeling free, many people felt something else. A quiet pressure. An unspoken question hanging in the air. What are you going to do with it? This is the tension that nobody talks about when they talk about weekends. The escape was real. The time was genuinely there. But somewhere along the way, rest had developed a new set of rules. Unwritten ones, harder to argue with precisely because nobody had put them into law. You were supposed to rest, yes. But you were also supposed to rest correctly. Think about a Sunday afternoon. The kind where you have no plans, no obligations, nothing pressing in any direction. For a brief moment, it feels like relief. And then, almost without noticing, something shifts. A low hum of unease begins. You start measuring the hours that remain. You wonder if you should be doing something more meaningful, something worth remembering, something that would justify the time you were given. The day isn't over, but already you are preparing to feel like you wasted it. This is not laziness. This is not ingratitude. It is what happens when rest is given a job to do. A person who works long hours all week might spend Friday night unable to sleep. Not from stress, but from a kind of emotional whiplash. The body knows it is tired. The mind does not know how to stop performing. Rest, for many people, has become something they must succeed at, something they can fail at, and the fear of failing at their own free time is, quietly, exhausting. There is something deeply ironic in this. The escape cycle. The rhythm that ancient cultures built into their calendars precisely to release people from the weight of obligation had accumulated its own weight. The weekend arrived carrying expectations. You should see people. You should go somewhere. You should feel restored, recharged, ready. And if you spent Saturday lying on a couch watching the light change across the ceiling, something in the modern world suggested you had done it wrong. This conflict is not loud. It does not announce itself. It lives in the small, familiar guilt of a Monday morning when someone asks, "How was your weekend?" And you search for an answer that sounds like enough. Like you used the time well, like you earned the right to have had it. What this reveals is something important about the nature of escape. A true escape requires permission. Not legal permission, not a day off approved by an employer, but internal permission. The willingness to stop measuring. The ability to exist for a period of time without producing anything, without improving anything, without becoming anything more than what you already are. That permission, my friends, turns out to be the hardest thing to give yourself. And without it, even 2 full days of freedom can feel strangely like another kind of work. At some point, the weekend stopped being just a break. It became a category. Travel companies built entire industries around it. Restaurants filled up on Friday evenings with a kind of collective exhale. Gyms marketed themselves as places to reclaim your weekend. Entertainment platforms designed their release schedules around Saturday morning attention. The two-day pause that workers had once fought for, that ancient instinctive need for rhythm and release, had been identified, packaged, and offered back to people as a product. This is not an accident. It is a logical outcome of a system that is very good at turning human needs into markets. And the weekend, it turned out, was one of the most reliable human needs there is. By the late 20th century, leisure had become one of the largest economic sectors in the world. In the United States alone, spending on recreational activities crossed into the trillions of dollars annually. People were not just resting, they were consuming their rest, purchasing experiences, booking escapes, filling their free time with activities that required planning, spending, and often a kind of low-level performance for the benefit of others watching online. Consider the way a weekend trip is experienced today. A person books accommodation weeks in advance, researches restaurants, checks the weather, builds an itinerary. They arrive somewhere new, move through it with a kind of purposeful efficiency, and document it in real time. By Sunday evening, they are tired in a way that feels oddly familiar, not unlike the tiredness of a work week. The escape has been completed, but whether they were truly away is a harder question to answer. This is not a criticism of how people choose to spend their time. People find genuine joy in travel, in experiences, in shared moments worth photographing. The human detail here is real and valid, but something worth noticing is how thoroughly the weekend has been filled, how completely the pause has been scheduled. The silence that once existed inside a day of rest, the unstructured, unmonitored space that ancient traditions considered sacred, has become increasingly difficult to find and increasingly unfamiliar when it does arrive. Research into rest and recovery has shown something that feels almost counterintuitive in a busy world. The brain does not restore itself through stimulation. It restores itself through stillness. The default mode network, the part of the brain active during quiet, undirected thought, plays a significant role in memory consolidation, creativity, and emotional processing. Genuine rest, the kind that actually repairs something, often looks like doing very little at all. And yet very little is exactly what modern weekend culture struggles to accommodate. There is always something to watch, somewhere to go, something to optimize. The escape cycle exists. The days are so there, but the quality of the escape has quietly shifted. It has moved from being a return to stillness toward being a change of stimulation. Different content, different location, different activity. But the underlying engine, running continuously, rarely stops. The weekend, in this sense, has been normalized into something that looks like freedom and functions, at least partly, like a continuation. So we return to the question we began with. Not what the weekend is, or how it was built, or what has been done with it, but what it means, what it reveals about the kind of creatures we are. Here's what the full arc of this history suggests. Human beings have never been able to move in one direction indefinitely. Not across ancient Mesopotamia, not through the noise of the Industrial Revolution, not inside the frictionless speed of the modern world. Somewhere in the deepest architecture of what we are, there is a need for interruption, a need to stop, to surface, to remember that time is not only a resource to be spent, but an experience to be inhabited. The escape cycle is not a luxury. It is a biological and psychological truth. We are not machines that run better with more fuel. We are living things that require rhythm, tension and release, effort and stillness. The long exhale after the long week. Every culture that has ever existed has known this, even when they expressed it in completely different ways. The Babylonian observing a lunar pause. The Jewish family gathering at sundown on Friday. The factory worker in 1920s Detroit clocking out on Saturday for the first time and not quite knowing what to do with himself. The feeling is the same across all of them. Something in the human being recognizes the pause and settles into it. If given the chance, what we have perhaps lost, somewhere in the long journey from sacred rest to scheduled leisure, is the understanding that the escape is not meant to prepare us for more work. It is not recovery time, not recharging, not optimization. Those are useful things, but they are not the point. The point is something quieter and harder to measure. It is the experience of existing without agenda, of being a person, fully, without needing to be a productive one. This is what the best moments of a weekend actually feel like, my friends. Not the planned ones, not the documented ones, but the small and accidental ones. A slow morning with no particular reason to move quickly. A conversation that goes longer than expected because nobody is watching the time. A walk taken without destination, where the mind loosens and the thoughts drift and something that had been knotted inside you quietly comes undone. These moments are not nothing. They are, in many ways, everything. They are the proof that you exist beyond your usefulness. The hidden history of weekends is, in the end, a hidden history of human longing. A longing not for more time exactly, but for time that belongs to a different register. Time that is not counted, not measured, not exchanged for anything. Time that simply passes gently, with you inside it. We built the weekend because we needed it. We fought for it because it mattered. And we continued to search for it, imperfectly, distractedly, sometimes while looking at our phones, because the need has never gone away. It never will. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.